Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 105. In this episode today, we will cover the first book, which is really a collection of short stories, of the world traveler and old money writer of Swedish, or maybe that's Danish descent. An author who lived as storied a life as any male author, from Denmark all the way to Kenya. According to her Wikipedia article, quote, post-colonial criticism of her work has linked her with contemporary British writers, and in some cases branded her as just another morally bankrupt white European aristocrat, close quote. Which is where we tend to go in our morally blinkered and bankrupt era of social, financial, and moral corruption in the West. Her work explores the complexities of relationships between men and women and nature and class and structure in the late 19th and early 20th century, a time of immense changes in the West between men and women. Writing and the way that she conducted her life will allow us to examine how the aristocratic gatekeepers of the past felt responsible for holding together and maintaining cultural standards, even while examining and critiquing those standards for a relatively highly literate public. It turns out that you can have two thoughts in your head and have two things be equally true at exactly the same time. Today, we will be covering the tales from Le Grand Siècle by talking about some of the tales in 7 Gothic Tales by Karen Blixen, a.k.a. Isak Dinesen. Leaders, it's time to figure out how to put up new gates in the culture for our future. And I open my comments today on 7 Gothic Tales by Karen Blixen, a.k.a. Isak Dinesen, by quoting directly from the first of her 7 Gothic Tales, The Deluge at Norderney. And I quote, during the first quarter of the last century, seaside resorts became the fashion, even in those countries of Northern Europe, within the minds of whose people the sea had hitherto held the role of the devil, the cold and voracious hereditary foe of humanity. The romantic spirit of the age, which delighted in ruins, ghosts, and lunatics, and counted a stormy night on the heath and a deep conflict of the passions a finer treat for the connoisseur than the ease of the salon and the harmony of philosophic system, reconciled even the most refined individuals to the eternal wilderness of the coast scenery and of the open seas. Ladies and gentlemen of the fashion abandoned the shade of their parks to come and walk upon the bleak shores and watch the untamable waves, the neighborhood of a shipwreck where, in low tide, the wreck was still in sight like a hardened black and salted skeleton, became a favorite picnic place where fair artists put up their easels. On the west coast of Holstein, the Bath of Norderney thus sprang up and flowered for a period of 20 years. Along the sandy roads of the downs, fine carriages and coaches came to unload trunks and cartons, and ladies on small feet, whose veils and chenilles blew about them in the fresh breeze, in front of neat little hotels and cottages. The Duke of Augustenburg, with his beautiful wife and his sister, who was a fine wit, and the Prince of Nowhere, honored the place with their presence. The landed nobility of Schleswig-Holstein, with pins and needles in their legs from the new political stir, and the representatives of Old Hamburg and Lübeck merchant houses, worth their weight in gold, together undertook the pilgrimage into the heart of nature. The peasants and fishermen of Norderney themselves learned to look upon the terrible and faithless gray monster westward of them as upon some kind of maître de plaisir. Here was a promenade, a club, and a pavilion, the rendezvous in the long summer evenings of many sweet colors and sounds. Ladies with marriageable daughters, over whose heads barren seasons of the courts and towns had washed, now watched fruitful courtships ripen on the sunny beach. Young dandies managed their mounts on the long sands in front of clear eyes. Old gentlemen dug themselves down into political and dynastic discussions in the club, their glasses of fine rum at their sides. And their young wives walked in their cashmeres on their arms to a lonely hollow in the downs, still sun-baked from the long summer day, to become one with nature, with the lime grass and the little wind-blown pansies, and to gaze straight up at the full moon high in the pale summer sky. The very air here had in its embrace a scornful vigor which incited and renewed the heart. Heinrich Heine, who visited the bath, held that the persevering smell of fish which clung to them would in itself be enough to protect the virtue of the young fisher-maidens of Norderney. But there were other nostrils and hearts to which the rank briny smell was intoxicating, even as the smell of gunpowder over the battlefield. There was even a small casino where the coquetry with the dangerous powers of existence could be carried on in a different measure. At times there were great balls, and on fine summer evenings the orchestra played upon the terrace. Baroness Karen Christens von Blixen-Finecke, born Dinesen, April 17, 1885, and died September 7, 1962, was a Danish author who wrote both in Danish and in English, according to her Wikipedia profile. Once again, pulling from Wikipedia. Born in Rungstedlund, north of Copenhagen, her father, Willem Dinesen, 1845 to 1895, was a writer, army officer, and politician. He served in the 1864 war by Denmark against Prussia, which was not yet united underneath Otto von Bismarck into Germany, and he also joined the French army against Prussia. He contracted syphilis after living among the Chippewa Indians in Wisconsin in the 1870s, and soon after that he committed suicide when his daughter Karen was around 9 years old. Her mother, Ingeborg Westenholz, born 1856 and died 1939, came from a wealthy Unitarian bourgeois merchant family of shipowners. Karen Dinesen was educated at home by her maternal grandmother and by her aunt, Mary B. Westenholz. She started writing and traveling as part of the well-heeled European bourgeoisie in her mid-20s and didn't stop until the beginning of the Second World War. Karen Blixen, a.k.a. Karen Dinesen, a.k.a. Isak Dinesen, was a fascinating character who, and the reason why we bring up the syphilis, who had an interesting and aristocratic life. She was part of what in polite society used to be called old money, and of course it is still called old money. She served, she saw her role in the world as being an individual who was holding up aristocratic standards, who was maintaining them against a rising tide, particularly a rising post-World War II tide of, well, tearing those aristocratic systems down. Remember, I said in the opening that she's often associated with British writers, and that's because of her work, her main work, her most prominent work for which she is well known, and we'll read this on the podcast next year, Out of Africa, which was turned into a movie in 1980, I believe it was 84 or 85, when Out of Africa was released, starring Meryl Streep. And Out of Africa is a novel that documents Baroness Blixen's adventures with her first husband in Africa. Matter of fact, her adventures in Africa and her life in Africa was so impactful that it changed how she viewed her role in society. She was educated, as I just said there, by her maternal grandmother and by her aunt, and was raised to believe in feminism, but not feminism in a middle-class sense, and definitely not feminism in an American sense, but feminism in a European aristocratic sense. The feminism that takes the guilt and shame, and we're going to talk a lot about this today, that women inherently carry is as part of their role in society, and redirects that guilt and shame towards social good. How does that align with feminism? Well, we can see in the life of Baroness Blixen and in her writings, particularly in Seven Gothic Tales, the female characters in her novels and in her short stories, of which there are many, many, they behave to our modern ears and to our modern sensibilities almost as if they are men. But that was unusual back in the day, and Karen Blixen, if she'd been of a different sort of aristocratic sense, would have been bound up with Aldous Huxley and his group of literary folks. But such as it were, she saw herself, being old money, as being above all of these nouveau riche folks who were coming in to the franchise in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. And she wrote as a reminder that the old things are still worth defending, because sometimes the old things were, and still are, the best things. So I chose the bumper music today because Vivaldi always puts me in mind of Fanfare Rondeau from the Suite of Symphonies for Brass, Strings, and Timpani, number 1, written by French composer Jean-Joseph Mouret, which was used, most notably, at least in my memory, as the opening theme music for the show that started in 1971 on public broadcasting systems in the United States, or PBS, that brought art and culture to the uncultured middle-class masses, starting in the 1970s, called Masterpiece Theater. Vivaldi always puts me in mind of the Masterpiece Theater theme music, and so I chose Vivaldi today as the bumper music for our podcast in between our sections. So I want to return to Seven Gothic Tales. I want to return to the Deluge at Norderney to make a point here, or to lead into a point that I'm going to talk about on the other side of the next bump. So bear with me here as I pick up from later on in The Deluge at Norderney by Isak Dinesen. The Cardinal Hamilcar von Sehestedt had, during the summer, been living in a small fisherman's house at some distance from the bath to collect his writings of many years in a book upon the Holy Ghost. With Joachim de Flora, who was born in 1202, the cardinal held that while the book of the Father is given in the Old Testament, that of the Son in the New Testament, the testament of the third person of the Trinity still remained to be written. This he had made the task of his life. He had grown up in the Westerlands and had preserved, during a long life of travels and spiritual work, his love for the coast scenery and the sea. In his leisure hours, he would go, after the example of St. Peter himself, a long way out on the sea with the fishermen in their boats to watch their work. He had with him in his cottage only a sort of valet or secretary, a man by the name of Casperson. This man was a former actor and adventurer, a brilliant fellow in his way, who spoke many languages and had been given to all sorts of studies. He was devoted to the cardinal, but he seemed a curious Sancho Panza for the noble knight of the church. The name of Hamilcar von Sehestedt was at that time famous all over Europe. He had been made a cardinal 3 years before, when he was only 70. He was a strange flower upon the old solid wood of the Sehestedt family tree. An old noble race of the province, he had lived for many hundreds of years for nothing but wars and their land to produce him. The one remarkable thing about them was that they had stuck, through many trials, to the ancient Roman Catholic faith of the land. They had no mobility of spirit to change what they had once got into their heads. The cardinal had 9 brothers and sisters, none of whom had shown any evidence of his spiritual life. It was as if some slowly gathered and quite unused store of intellectuality in the tribe had come out in this one child of it. Perhaps a woman, imported from outside, had dropped a thought into the blood of it before becoming altogether a Sehestedt, or some idea in a book had impressed itself upon a young boy before he had been taught that books and ideas mean nothing, and all this had mounted up. The extraordinary talents of young Hamilcar had been recognized, not by his own people, but by his tutor, who had been the tutor to the Crown Prince of Denmark himself. He succeeded in taking the boy off to Paris and Rome. Here, this new light of genius suddenly flared up in a clear blaze, impossible to ignore. There existed a tale of how the Pope himself, after the young priest had been presented to him, had seen in a dream how this youth had been set apart by Providence to bring back the great Protestant countries under the Holy See. Still, the Church had tried the young man severely. Distrustful of many of the ideas and powers in him, of his visionary gift, and of the most striking feature of his nature, an immense capacity for pity, which embraced not only the sinful and miserable, but seemed to turn even toward the high and holy of the world. Their severity did not hurt him. Obedience was in his nature. To his great power of imagination, he joined a deep love of law and order. Perhaps in the end these two sides of his nature came to the same thing. To him everything seemed possible and equally likely to fall in with the beautiful and harmonious scheme of things. The Pope himself later said of him, quote, "If after the destruction of our present world I were to charge one human being with the construction of a new world, the only person whom I would trust with this work would be my young Hamilcar." Close quote. Whereupon, however, he quickly crossed himself 2 or 3 times. So just so we're all clear, went and looked on Google during the bump there, and Out of Africa was released December 18th, 1985, according to the glorious website that exists for movie folk like myself, IMDb. It was rated PG, And it starred Robert Redford, Meryl Streep, and it was directed by Sidney Pollack. Now, it was not, if I remember correctly, a Best Picture winner. And in looking at the IMDb, list, it did win 7 Oscars with 30 wins and 30 nominations total. And if I click on this, let's see, it won. Oh, it did. So it won Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Director and Best Writing. Out of Africa did. So I was mistaken. Apparently, it did win a bunch of awards. All right, look at that. Sidney Pollack got himself an Oscar for Out of Africa. All right, well, good for him. I like to be wrong, particularly about films. By the way, you can check out of Africa on Netflix if you want to check that out. By the way, Meryl Streep was nominated for Best Actress for that. She didn't win, but Sidney Pollack did for Best Director and for Best Picture. All right. Anyway, so speaking of Out of Africa, the style of writing that you get from Karen Blixen or Isak Dinesen. And by the way, when she took Isak Dinesen, she was sort of kind of trying to do a callback to her father, who she loved quite dearly. And by the way, his suicide took a lot out of Karen Blixen and impacted her throughout the remainder of her life. As a matter of fact, it impacted her so deeply that she connected once again with his particular disease, syphilis, and the Baroness often claimed that she had contracted syphilis, and that was what was causing her decline. However, there's some evidence that perhaps what she was treated with in order to treat the syphilis, which I believe was some variation of mercury, was actually poisoning her and created an autoimmune disorder, which of course caused her to decline precipitously as she aged. Anyway, when we think about her writing, going back to her writing, when we think of her writing, we think of Out of Africa, when we think of 7 Gothic Tales, we have to place Karen Blixen's work firmly in the tradition of the short story, which she did ride to much fame. As a matter of fact, 7 Gothic Tales was the first writing of Karen Blixen that gained her initial fame. The history of the short story rode on technology and access to information, not necessarily by men, but by women, because the short story format really started in periodicals. It really started in how magazines were distributed, kind of in the same way that TikTok videos or social media in general is dominated by not only women, but by people, men included, with a feminine temperament. Now, the short story as a medium allowed interpersonal attention to really be drawn to people with cultural talent and cultural taste, and it created a feedback loop. And it created a feedback loop where women could observe what was going on in society and culture, comment on it, write about it, pass judgment on it, and then seek to critique it and correct it. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that women traditionally hold the guilt and shame of a secular society. And in a Christian society, they leverage this guilt and shame into action for social change from a Christian lens. Now, Karen Blixen wasn't necessarily Christian, but she was based in Christian culture, particularly Christian European aristocratic culture, which was reflexively Protestant. You can see that in her description, her tongue-in-cheek description of the cardinal and the pope. Now, In a more secular society like the one we live in our current era, and the one that leaders are leading in our current era, women still leverage the same guilt and shame into action, but now they're focused on middle-class social norming through a secular lens. Thus, the creation in our time of the concept of a quote-unquote Karen. You kind of had to see where I was going with this. Or a middle-aged, middle-class white woman who complains about the quality of the service she is getting, usually in a customer service interaction. Or she's the one who calls the cops when something culturally seems to be out of order. The Karens, the aristocratic women of the past, European and American alike, the short story writers, the cultural tastemakers, these women, and we underestimate the role of women in this space. Matter of fact, we don't even talk about it because it seems to be verboten. It seems to be something that we can see but not say anything about. Women are really the gatekeepers of culture, not men. Sure, men create cultural institutions. Men build buildings, and then we build the content that goes inside of those buildings. We build the technology, right, that runs the systems of those buildings. And of course, it's men that are getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning when the weather sucks and fixing the technology, fixing the infrastructure, and fixing the building so that women can later on complain about the ways in which they fixed the building, fixed the technology, or fixed the infrastructure. This dynamic exists, but it is only in our time where the friction between men and women is at its highest in the West and in America in particular, that we seem to have to repeat these things that our grandparents and even our great-grandparents and even our great-great-grandparents just sort of knew. Women are the cultural gatekeepers, whether we like it or not, and how they culturally gatekeep, what technology they use to culturally gatekeep, and why and what they culturally gatekeep on, whether it is class, ethnicity, race, appropriate behavior, it doesn't matter. Those areas become the dominant place where culture winds up going, whether we all like it or not. Isak Dinesen was an aristocratic woman. No getting around that. As a matter of fact, she began writing 7 Gothic tales. She began writing the short stories that were in 7 Gothic tales while still in Kenya, and putting together, really conceptualizing all of the things that were happening to her with her and her womanizing husband, from whom she got the syphilis, and everything else that was going on in Nairobi in Kenya at that time, and really conceptualizing that in terms of colonialism, in terms of how Europeans related to Africans. And according to her Wikipedia biography, while still in Kenya, Blixen had written her brother Thomas that, quote, "I have begun to do what we brothers and sisters do when we don't know what else to resort to. I have started to write a book. I have been writing in English because I thought it would be more profitable," close quote. She returned to Denmark at age 46 and completed 7 Gothic tales in 1933. And though she had difficulty finding a publisher for the book, eventually she did, and it was published in English and was chosen as a Book of the Month Club selection in the United States, and of course the United Kingdom, and then weirdly enough in her own home country of Denmark. Karen Blixen was an aristocratic, like I said, gatekeeper. And one of the stories that is in Seven Gothic Tales really reflects this. And it's the one that we're going to pull a couple of clips from as we talk about this idea of aristocratic cultural gatekeepers. We're going to pull from this next story entitled The Old Chevalier. And I quote, "My father had a friend, old Baron von Brackle, who had in his day traveled much and known many cities and men. Otherwise, he was not at all like Odysseus, who and could least of all be called ingenious, for he had shown very little skill in managing his own affairs. Probably from a sense of failure in this respect, he carefully kept from discussing practical matters with an efficient younger generation, keen on their careers and success in life. But on theology, the opera, moral right and wrong, and other unprofitable pursuits, he was a pleasant talker. He had been a singularly good-looking young man, a sort of ideally handsome youth, and although no trace of this past beauty could be found in his face, the history of it could be traced in a certain light-hearted dignity and self-reliance, which are the product of a career of good looks, and which will be found, unaccountably, in the carriage of those shaking ruins who used to look into the mirrors of the last century with delight. In this way, one should be able to point out, at a danse macabre, the skeletons of the real great beauties of their time. One night he and I came to discuss an old theme, which has done its duty in the literature of the past, namely, whether one is ever likely to get any real benefit, any lasting moral satisfaction out of forsaking an inclination for the sake of principle. And in the course of our talk, he told me the following story. On a rainy night in the winter of 1874, on an avenue in Paris, a drunken young girl came up and spoke to me. I was then, as you will understand, quite a young man. I was very upset and unhappy, and was sitting bareheaded in the rain on a seat along the avenue because I had just parted from a lady whom, as we said then, I did adore, and who had, within this last hour, tried to poison me. This, though it has nothing to do with what I was going to tell you, was in itself a curious story. I had not thought of it for many years until, when I was last in Paris, I saw the lady in her box at the opera, now a very old woman, with two charming little girls in pink who were, I was told, her great-granddaughters. She was lovely no more, but I had never, in the time that I have known her, seen her look so contented. I was sorry afterward that I had not gone up and called on her in her box, for though there had been but little happiness for either of us in that old love affair of ours, I think that she would have been as pleased to be reminded of the beautiful young woman who made men unhappy as I had been to remember, vaguely as it was, the young man who had been so unhappy that long time ago." Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. All right, so looking at the aristocratic nature, and I keep going back to this over and over again because we don't really talk too much on this podcast about the impact of class. We don't really talk too much about the impact of how people think about class in America because, quite frankly, in an American context, we all think we're middle class. Even Bill Gates, weirdly enough, if you ask him, will actually say that he's a normal middle-class guy, even though he flies on a private jet and tells you what kind of fake meat to eat. But that's a uniquely American thing. In most other parts of the world, heck, in most other times, in most other parts of the world, class was very clearly defined. Upper class, middle class, lower class. And in a lot of cases, there was an upper class, and then there's everybody else, which increasingly in our globalized world, that seems to be the direction that our dear leaders and our wizards of smart seem to want to push us. Now, I'm not talking about class from an economic perspective, although that's usually how people frame it, particularly if you're a leader who believes in the culture or the economics of Marx. I personally find Marx to be a bad predictor of human nature because, well, the guy basically spent all of his time in a library in London thinking. He didn't actually get out with other people. So we're not going to take the Marxian view of class, nor are we going to take the Marxian view of culture to look at this issue of aristocracy and the need for aristocratic gatekeepers. Instead, we're going to look at this from a capitalistic perspective where we deny class, we pretend it doesn't exist, but we all know what luxury brands are. And we all know that there are certain restaurants you can't get into. We all know that there is a delineation between first class in the plane and everybody else flying in the cattle car and coach. And we know that when someone pulls up to our meeting in a BMW or a Lexus or a Tesla, they're saying something. They're subtly socially signaling to us what class they are that we are not. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of wealthy people who drive Toyotas and wear jeans and have boots and cowboy hats or baseball caps. I personally know plenty of them who could buy and sell that guy or woman in the Tesla several times over. But the point is not about, again, economics. It's more about culture. What culturally are we saying when we empower, well, gatekeepers? And what exactly is a gatekeeper? So the idea of gatekeeping has actually fallen on hard times in an era of the internet. Ever since the commercial internet got turned on in 1989, boundaries, borders, gates have been falling. Now, they were falling before that, don't get me wrong, but what the internet did was it accelerated the erosion of the gates. As a matter of fact, if I may be so bold, the internet allowed individuals who may have been in those aristocratic classes and who may have been individuals that might have had to police those gates. The internet allowed those people to feel the freedom to no longer police those gates, to no longer create cultural and social content that kept certain people out based on them being, to paraphrase from the French badly, déclassé. The reason gatekeepers existed back in the day, and particularly back in the 20s and 30s, back in Karen Blixen's day, the Baroness Karen Blixen's day, the reason gatekeepers existed among the aristocratic classes was to police cultural standards. This is something we fail to understand because we believe in democracy, small d democracy, where everybody can be in every franchise, everywhere, all the time. Anyone can be anything that they want. I mean, heck, we're even democratizing gender and sexual orientation these days. We're trying to democratize biology, which is, of course, the logical conclusion of all this democratization. But even in that democratization process, which, by the way, began with a real bang in the post-World War II era of the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, and was accelerated by the presence of the internet. This process of having cultural standards and then democratizing them has led to a decline in gatekeeping. Cultural standards included all of the interactions between men and women, interactions between races and ethnic groups, which really bothers us, and even the interactions in our teams between leaders and followers. I think of the show, as I'm talking off of my prepared notes here today, I think of the show Mad Men. This is kind of a little bit of a side. I never really liked that show. And the reason why I never really liked that show had nothing to do with the set design or the actors that they picked or even the lines that they were speaking. I never liked that show because it was created, written, produced, directed, and distributed by people who hated the cultural gatekeeping and the cultural gatekeepers that the characters in that show represented. This is the tension, and you could feel it in Mad Men. Things were better in the past, we all say, but they were better in the past because there were certain people who held a standard, held a line, manned a wall, or defended a gate, and said the masses, the demos, will not advance beyond this point. Of course, this began to decline with the boomers, those who infamously stated as a cultural milieu and a generational milieu to never trust anyone over 30. This is now morphed, of course, into OK Boomer from the millennials and the Gen Zers. And everyone is now responsible, unfortunately, with this decline, for manning the barricades in culture everywhere without real guidance from the top, from the sides, or even from the inside on what a standard for culture should actually be. Or even worse, and this is worse, where such a standard should emanate from. Writers, journalists, academics, celebrities, and others used to be the people who policed the culture. And by the way, they did this informally. They did this through parties, and they did this through cultural events. When Blixen writes about a young man wandering the streets of Paris and then running into a young woman, the cultural gatekeeping that is involved in that interaction is evident from the young man's title. It's obvious, at least if you know what the signs are. Which is why Blixen's work probably isn't read too much anymore. Or it's read through a feminist lens, or it's read in a way that tries to reconcile her aristocratic leanings with our more insistent demos expansion in our own time. By the way, those writers, journalists, academics, celebrities, and others who used to police the culture, well, they are the people now who have not only pulled up the gates over the course of the last almost 50 years of the internet, but they are also the people who behave in culture as if the gates were never needed in the first place, as if they were always a problem, as if the gates somehow served no purpose whatsoever. And that's the real tragedy of a lack of gatekeeping in our time. That's the real confusion that we're experiencing in culture. We don't even have an explanation of why the gates were necessary, because the people who pulled up the gates, they failed to pass on that understanding to the very people who need it. So we're going to pick up with the Old Chevalier. We're going to read a couple of different sections from this story in 7 Gothic Tales by the Baroness, Karen Blixen. I'm just going to pick out some pieces of this and put some parts together so that we can generate an idea and talk about some solutions to some problems, like the problem of how to gatekeep a culture. Back to the book, back to 7 Gothic Tales, back to the Old Chevalier. Love with very young people is a heartless business. We drink at that age from thirst or to get drunk. It is only later in life that we occupy ourselves with the individuality of our wine. By the way, this is the old man talking to the young person. A young man in love is essentially enraptured by the forces within himself. You may come back to that view again in a second adolescence. I knew a very old Russian in Paris, enormously rich, who used to keep the most charming young dancers, and who, when once asked whether he had or needed to have any illusions as to their feelings for him, thought the question over and said, "I do not think, if my chef succeeds in making me a good omelet, that I bother much whether he loves me or not." A young man could not have put his answer into those words, but he might say that he did not care whether his wine merchant was of his own religion or not, and imagine that he had got close to the truth of things. In middle age, though, you arrive at a deeper humility, and you come to consider it of importance that the person who sells or grows your wine shall be of the same religion as you yourself. In this case of my own, of which I am telling you, my youthful vanity, if I had too much of it, was to be taught a lesson very soon. For during the months of that winter, while we were both living in Paris, where her house was the meeting place of many belles esprits, and she herself admired dilettante in music and arts, I began to think that she was making use of me, or of her own love for me, if such could be said, to make her husband jealous. This has happened, I suppose, to many young men down through the ages, without the total sum of their experience being much use to the young man who finds himself in the same position today. I began to wonder what the relations between those two really were like, and what strange forces there might be in her or in him to toss me about between them in this way, and I think that I began to be afraid. She was jealous of me, too, and would scold me with a sort of moral indignation, as if I had been a groom failing in his duties. I thought that I could not live without her, and also that she did not want to live without me, but exactly what she wanted me for I did not know. Her contact hurt me, as one is hurt by touching iron on a winter day. You do not know whether the pain comes from heat or from cold. Before I had ever met her, I had read about her family, whose name ran down for centuries throughout the history of France, and learned that there used to be werewolves amongst them, and I sometimes thought that I should have been happier to see her really go down on all fours and snarl at me, for then I should have known where I was. And even up to the end, we had hours together of a particular charm, for which I shall always be thankful to her. During my first year in Paris, before I knew any people there, I had taken up studying the history of the old hotels of the town, and this hobby of mine appealed to her, so that we used to dive into old quarters and ages of Paris and dwell together in the age of Abelard or Molière, and while we were playing in this way, she was serious and gentle with me, like a little girl. But at other times I thought that I could stand it no longer, and would try to get away from her, and any suspicion of this was enough, I imagined, to make her lie awake at night, thinking out new methods of punishing me. It was between us the old game of cat and the mouse, probably the original model of all the games of the world, because the cat has more passion in it, and the mouse only the plain interest of existence. The mouse is bound to become tired first. Toward the end, I thought that she wished us to be found out. She was so careless in this liaison of ours. In those days, a love affair had to be managed with prudence. And then a little bit further down, speaking again of the woman, but his wife's love for him and her jealousy were indeed of a strange nature, for she was in love with him, I knew, from the moment that she began to speak of him. Probably I had known it a long time before, and she was jealous. She suffered, she cried, she was, as I have told you, ready to kill if nothing else would help her, and all the time that fight, which was very likely the only reality in her life, was not a struggle for possession, but a competition. She was jealous of him, as if he had been another young woman of fashion, her rival, or as if she herself had been a young man who envied him in his triumphs. I think that she was in herself always alone with him in a world that she despised. When she rode so madly, when she surrounded herself with admirers, she had her eye on him, a competitor in a chariot race, as a competitor in a chariot race would have his eyes only on the driver just beside him. As for the rest of us, we only existed for her insofar as we were to belong to her or to him, and she took her lovers as she took up her fences to pile up more conquests in the man with whom she was in love. And a little bit later on, I always thought it unfair to women that she has never been alone in the world. Adam had a time, whether long or short, when he could wander about on a fresh and peaceful earth among the beasts in full possession of his soul, and most men are born with a memory of that period. But poor Eve found him there, with all his claims upon her, the moment she looked into the world. That is a grudge that woman has always had against the Creator. She feels that she is entitled to have that epic of paradise back for herself. Only worse luck, when chasing a time that has gone, one is bound to get hold of it by the tail, the wrong way round. Thus these young witches got everything they wanted, as in a catapautric image. And finally, it was towards the end of our interview that she tried to poison me. I believe that this was really against her program, that she had meant to tell me what she thought of me when I already had the poison in me, but had been unable to control herself for so long. There was, as you will understand, something unnatural in drinking coffee at that stage of our dialogue. By the way, pause. The dialogue is the dialogue of the breakup, because of the old man, back when he was a young man, was trying to break up with his married lover, right? And so in the course of the breakup, this event happens in the story. Okay, back to the book. The way in which she insisted upon it and her sudden deadly silence as I raised the cup to my mouth gave her away. I could still, although I just touched it, recall the mortal insipid taste of the opium, and had I emptied the cup, it could not have made my stomach rise and the marrow in my bones turn to water more than did the abrupt and fatal conviction that she wanted me to die. I let the cup drop, faint as a drowning man, and stood and stared at her as she made one wild movement as if she meant to throw herself at me still. Then we stood quite immovable for a minute, both knowing that all was lost. And after a little while, she began to rock and whimper, with her hands at her mouth, suddenly changed into a very old woman. For my own part, I was not able to utter a sound, and I think that I just ran from the house as soon as I had strength enough to move. The air, the rain, and the street itself met me like old forgotten friends, faithful still in the hour of need. All right, so from a Deluge to the Old Chevalier, right? And, of course, the other 7 tales, which we didn't cover. And eventually we'll probably revisit this entire topic that we've been covering today when we talk about Out of Africa Next Year by Karen Blixen. We wind up in a spot where we have to discuss, in sort of real terms for leaders, what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about gatekeeping. And not maybe what we're talking about in essence, but more so, how do you gatekeep? And I'm seeing more and more of this idea starting to pop up as people are growing tired of having things they culturally enjoy being shared with the masses. Now, a lot of this trouble, as I said before, can be traced to the internet, right? The internet is a connection and engagement machine. And so because it is a connection and engagement machine, you're going to have people who are going to connect and who are going to engage. And because these people are going to connect and because these people are going to engage, they're going to bring the demos, they're going to bring democracy, they're going to expand the niches, they're going to try to cram mass into spaces. And of course, the mass is going to bring ideas, concepts, even ideologies that you don't like to the thing you do enjoy. So, if you are a leader creating something, How do you gatekeep it? How do you keep the masses out? Who sets the standard? From where does the standard emanate? These are philosophical questions that can be decided community by community. So if I am in the comic book community, or if I'm in the Lord of the Rings community, or if I'm in the if I'm in the Star Wars community, how do I gatekeep when an entity like a Paramount or an Amazon or a Disney comes along and brings its masses with it, its masses of eyeballs with it, to the thing that I love, that I have been protecting for so long? How do I not fall for the seduction that bigness brings? Well, there's some practical ways to not fall for that seduction, and they're not sexy, just like most things in leadership, and they're not cool, just like most things in leadership, but they are practical, they are useful, and they do work. By the way, all of you who like video games out there, you might want to start paying attention to these kinds of practices, because guess what? Hollywood is coming for your properties and bringing the masses along with them. So how do you gatekeep? How do you keep out the masses when they are brought by a gigantic behemoth like Hollywood, or a subset of Hollywood, Disney? Well, one of the key things that you can do as a leader is you can use social media to distribute the marketing of your cultural product or your cultural idea, but not use social media to invite people to participate in events that define the cultural event. This is a fine line distinction, and you're going to have to figure out how to do this to your own individual means and, of course, to your own individual ends, but you will have to figure out how to do it if you want to keep people out. Number 2, you'll have to say no to being inclusive. I know. This rubs against the grain of everything in our postmodern culture. This rubs against the postmodern mindset. But guess what? You all instinctively know that everything isn't for everyone, and everyone can't belong to something. As an example, I see this with people who talk about something that I like, which is jiu-jitsu, right? And I enjoy doing that. But 90% of people don't make it from a white belt to a blue belt. 90%. Because it's too hard. Jiu-jitsu gatekeeps by being too hard. If we made it easier, and trust me, there are some schools out there, and there are some instructors out there that are belt factories, I'm not naming anybody in particular, but that make it easier. But guess what? Every single person who goes through that easier keyhole, that broader door, when they show up at a tournament, they wind up getting their behind handed to them by people who pass through the narrow door where 90% of people can't go. Say no to being inclusive, and state the reasons why exclusivity is so important for culture, and be prepared, and this is important as a leader, to defend those reasons. Going back to jiu-jitsu for just a moment, there's the reason why 90% of people don't make it from white belt to blue belt. The reason why that happens is because it's hard, and it's demoralizing, and it wrecks your ego. And none of the tools that you've brought, even from previous martial arts, are going to help you here, because your mindset is wrong, not your physical attributes. Number 3, keep out the influencers. You know those people who seek to spread the word about your culture because they like it so much. Keep them out. Diminish their reach. Stop talking about them. Matter of fact, don't even let them come to your parties, right? Don't elevate clever marketing. Instead, elevate actual talent. So if you've got an influencer who can actually do the thing that your community likes, and you want to elevate that person, cool. Elevate them within their own community. But the second that they decide to leave your community and spread the word about what it is you're doing, there need to be harsh sanctions for those folks. That's how you gatekeep. Number 4, measure the true commitment of fans versus the commitment or the lack of commitment of casual participants and, even worse, venal observers. There are three different kinds of people in the world now. There's the audience in the stands, there's the people who are actually in the arena, and then, of course, there's the ones who are actually doing the work. Now, there's always been three kinds of people, but the differentiations, the gates between the fans and the people doing the work were a lot stronger back in the day. To re-strengthen those gates, we have to be able to determine who's a fan and who's a casual observer. Finally, number 5, if you really want to gatekeep in the postmodern world of communication, entertainment, attention, and awareness that we all live in, and if you really want to lead on this gatekeeping, and you don't want to do it from an aristocratic bent, well, elevate people within the community who have taste, discernment, intellect, and critical thinking abilities about the thing you're making, about the cultural product you're creating. And don't elevate those who make emotional appeals, who don't have taste, lack discernment, have poor levels of intellect, and, of course, don't have the ability to think critically. Will this require you to engage in the dreaded act of judging and making judgments and then defending them? Absolutely. But then again, if you don't, then you might just as well let in everybody anyway. Right? Don't worry. This is a complicated topic with a lot of different threads, and we're going to revisit this because I can already hear the objections beginning, and I haven't even stopped talking, and the music hasn't even started rolling. So, for the moment, that's it for me. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.